Hello, everyone. Welcome to History 4A. In this lecture, we're going to talk very briefly about some of the historical implications of some of our early civilizations in Middle East and Africa. We're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about Mesopotamia, specifically its beginnings in Sumer, and then we're going to be talking about the Nile. And one of the things we want to emphasize in this lecture and we want to really talk about is kind of the importance of geography and what we can surmise and infer by the importance of geography during this time period. So we're going to begin here with the history of Mesopotamia. Now, although Mesopotamia is all the land, as we often talk about, between these two rivers here, let me make this red so it's easier to see here, between these two rivers, where we're really going to be focusing on is this region down here in the south known as Sumer, right? So it's all this area right here that we're going to be focusing on. And although we usually refer to this top area, the earliest traces begin here. Now, we're going to be talking about several different periods in Mesopotamian history. Your reading will talk about this a little bit more. And if you have more questions, there's obviously some wonderful resources online to take a look at as well. So, we begin with what we call the Uruk period. And the Uruk period was from 3800 to 3200 BC, and this was a tremendously creative period with the invention of the wheel and the plow, the planting of the first orchards, mostly of dates and figs and olives, and the development of metal casting. And perhaps most significant was writing, or the writing known as cuneiform, which you can see kind of in the background here, a series of wedges and lines here. You can see this right here, little triangles and wedges. That kind of gives us our glimpse of record keeping during this time period and the importance of writing. Now, people built cities in Sumer with walls, circuits of up to 5 miles in length, and the buildings were often made of mud brick with the amount of sand and dirt available in the area. The most impressive of these buildings were their temples, or their ziggurats. And because these temples existed, we now know that the temple priesthoods dominated society. So this is a very theocratic form of very theocratic system with these giant ziggurats as kind of the center of these big cities. Now, in our next period, the dynastic period, fierce competition between cities and perhaps inside of them led to the emergence of local strongmen who we refer to as Lugals. Lugals basically evolved later into kings. Now, kings claimed to be the representatives of the gods and to rule by the favor of the gods, and this process introduced a theocratic kingship. As warfare became more important, large landowners formed a military aristocracy. So we go from kind of priests running a theocratic priesthood to the development of Lugals or strongmen who develop into kings, and then we get this theocratic kingship that develops. Now, and then, of course, as warfare becomes more important, you need very wealthy landowners to be able to support that, so we have the development of an aristocracy class. Now, as we can see in the map, Mesopotamia is a very broad open plain surrounded by deserts, and beyond the deserts by mountains. The region has no natural frontiers to ward off migrants or conquerors, and areas beyond Mesopotamia were inhabited by people of lower cultural development who coveted the comparative riches and security of Mesopotamia. Now, after about 2350 BC, Sumer was several times overrun by outsiders. And now, eventually, Sargon conquered Sumer from Akkad to the north, and then expanded his holdings, as did his son after him, to the east and the west. And this first imperial state demanded little of its subjects, and ironically was itself conquered by Sumerian culture. So he came in, conquered it, Akkadians, and then eventually the Sumerians came back in. Now, after Akkadian rule eventually weakened, there was a period of relative independence for Sumerian cities, followed by Babylonian conquest. Now, Hammurabi was the most famous and powerful of the Babylonians, or Amorites. His law code was influential for centuries, and like the Akkadians before them, the Babylonians developed and spread Sumerian culture. Now, culture is very important when we talk about ancient civilizations, and we usually break it up into the ideas of law and religion and economics and different aspects of that as well. But in religion, in Mesopotamia, people were polytheistic and syncretistic, which meant that they worshiped many gods, and they often blended different religious faiths into different practices. Sky gods were generally thought of as male and related to power. Earth gods were thought of as female and related to fertility. Individual forces of nature were also invested with divine power, known as animism. Now, this is a habit of mind that sees nothing as wholly lifeless. So there's spirits, or the gods can reside in the rocks, in the earth, in the sky. Gods and goddesses differed from humans in supernatural powers and immortality. They were capricious. Religion sought to propitiate them, and religion was pessimistic and fatalistic, and it had no ethical dimension at all. This outlook was perhaps related to the geography and politics of the region. If you live in a region that anything can happen, the gods may seem as being very capricious. Now, religion also served as an impressive attempt to begin to systemize knowledge about the natural world. Okay, so in other words, we have lots of questions about us, so we're going to use religion to help organize that in some fashion. Now, law is also really important, and you're reading about that this week with the Hammurabi's Code, or next week you'll be reading about that. Law was issued by councils of notables in conjunction with priests and kings. It was not abstract and philosophical, like we see in ancient Greece later on in this course, in ancient Rome, or even today, like the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. Publishing laws in public places established the important, and in public places, established the important principles that all are subject to the law, that the law belongs to everyone, and that the law rules, not men. And that's very important. Like I said, it was very practical, not this philosophical discussion. Now, we also see developments of literature if we talk about culture. The most famous of these works and remarkable achievements was the Epic of Gilgamesh. The epic is a Sumerian work dating to around 2500 BCE that survived in later versions to around 800 BCE, which kind of shows how quickly, how long it was distributed throughout this time period. Now, an epic, as it says right here, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is a work on a grand scale dealing with gods and heroes. It's very serious in tone, elevated in language, and universalizing in outlook, which means this could apply to lots of different civilizations and cultures. In the tale, the story of Gilgamesh, it's basically the adventures and friendship of King Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu. It contains a mythical account of the civilizing process and a very poignant reflection on mortality as the irreducible element in the human condition. The only difference between us and the gods is that the gods are immortal and human beings are not, and human beings are trying to always reach this idea of immortality and become more like the gods. Now, we've looked at literature, we've looked at law, and we looked at religion. Science was also very important, or in a way practiced during this time period. And it was probably derived from what else than just watching the heavens, measuring the fields, and regulating irrigation hydraulics, all of which are very important, either requirements for an agricultural society or the repercussions of having more free time because of agriculture. Sumerians developed the decimal and hexadecimal system. That's why we have like 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. That would be the sexadecimal system. Sumerians also understood place values in numbers, that there's a difference between, the number 35 and the number 53 based on their place value. So the tens versus the ones. And they also anticipate a lot of Greek developments in mathematics. So a lot of geometry and those kind of more practical sciences and practical mathematics, mostly for measuring, were developed in Mesopotamia and then built upon by the ancient Greeks. Now, Sumerian culture gradually spread over much of West Asia and directly or indirectly influenced all the peoples who emerged within or who conquered those lands, including the later empire-building Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, and even the Turks. Now, specific Sumerian practices and beliefs were adapted for millennia. So we're going to turn now to Egypt, ancient Egypt here. So if if anything, ancient Egypt has given us lots of mythology and lots of stories. And the Greek writer Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile. And so it was. Now, the Nile, of course, is a very long river, a couple little area tributaries and a large river that begins and runs all the way through northerly direction, some 750 miles from the last cataract to the Mediterranean. And it floods annually and predictably, an area of 5 to 15 miles wide. In fact, I just read a report today that in parts of on the beginning, the headwaters of the Nile, they're dealing with excessive flooding, which hasn't happened in a long time, considering a lot of the Nile is now controlled by dams and cataracts and lakes. Now, it floods annually, an area of about 5 to 15 miles wide, and about 5% of Egypt, only about 5% of Egypt is habitable because of this. Now, without the Nile, there would be only barren desert. And from as early as about 5000 BCE, some small communities along the Nile began to drain marshes, irrigate, and plant crops, mainly cereal grains, oats and wheat and those kind of grains. Now, slowly, these communities coalesced in what we refer to as nomes, under what we call nomarchs. Now, we don't really know what they were called. This is the Greek term that was given to us. Now, then the nomes of the south, this area down here in the south here, known as Upper Egypt, because it is the source of the Nile, and the north, the lower part of Egypt, formed into larger entities. It seems that a need to control irrigation led to political organization on a larger scale, and much about this period is shrouded in legend. But about 3100 BCE, Menes, an emperor or the pharaoh known as Menes, united Upper and Lower Egypt, and this unification ushered in what we refer to as the historical period of Egypt. Now, historians divide Egypt's historical period into 30 dynasties, or families of rulers. The dynasties are grouped into the Old, the Middle, and the New Kingdoms, with intermediate periods in between. So in between all of these periods, what we would call the intermediate periods. Now, the Old Kingdom was an era of great vitality, security, and prosperity, and Egypt was isolated and untroubled by invaders. A distinctive Egyptian kingship evolved. The word pharaoh, which we may now know, we refer to the ancient kings of Egypt as pharaohs. This comes from the Egyptian word per-a, which means the great house. Pharaoh was one of the gods and guaranteed Egypt's prosperity and security, and in turn, Egypt's prosperity and security legitimized the pharaoh. The Great Pyramids of Giza symbolize this old kingdom. And this is kind of an important concept in Egyptian history, this idea that the only reason this system survived was because prosperity was there. And in ancient China, we have something very similar known as the mandate of heaven, that the only reason the emperor is allowed to lead is because things are great. As soon as things don't do so bad, he can be removed and someone can be replaced, which is kind of what we see during the periods between these different kingdoms. Now, the Middle Kingdom was a period of more widely dispersed rule. Pharaohs shared power with local notables. This period was important in the elaboration of Egyptian religion because the emphasis moved beyond the royal dynasty to nobles and even ordinary people. Now, around 1700 BCE, the Hyksos, a Semitic peoples from Palestine, conquered Egypt. Now, the hatred for foreign rule eventually led to a dynasty from Upper Egypt to drive out the Hyksos and inaugurate the new kingdom. Now, fired by ambition and a desire to ward off future conquests, the Egyptians built an empire that extended into Mesopotamia and along the shore of eastern Mediterranean. And this was a brilliant cosmopolitan period. So you've got the Middle Kingdom developed, an invasion by Hyksos, and because of this invasion during the New Kingdom, the Egyptian rulers are like, no more invasions. We'll go out and invade those people before they come and invade us. Now, after about 1400 BCE, the Egyptians confronted the Hittites, a very powerful and expanding people from Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, and the first Indo-European speakers in recorded history. In 1274 BCE at Kadesh in northern Syria, the Egyptians and the Hittites fought a battle that left them both crippled and declining. Now, if we talk a little bit about this kind of society that we're dealing with here, everything starts with the pharaoh in this what we call a two-class society. There's the pharaoh and everybody else. Now, Egypt first displayed an abstract sense of rule, the separation of ruler and office, and the complete removal of the ruler from the ordinary realm of humans. And this plays very importantly into the religion of ancient Egypt. Now, religion grew more complicated over time. The peace and prosperity of the Old Kingdom led to a very happy, optimistic outlook, very different from the Mesopotamian religion we talked about. And the concept of the afterlife as a continuation of this life, not something better, was reserved mainly to the pharaoh, his family, and perhaps a few key advisors. Now, the Middle Kingdom, as I mentioned, saw a profusion of temples and new cults. Herodotus called the Egyptians the most religious of all people, and this might have been a reemergence of pre-dynastic religion or a response to unsettled conditions. And at this time, the afterlife became considered available to everyone. Now, a very important, crucial concept that governed the way religion and society ran was this idea of ma'at. The idea of ma'at is the idea of truth, justice, balance, and order. Now, the myth of Osiris revealing the Middle Kingdom, was very revealing that the Middle Kingdom was very popular. The New Kingdom saw the remarkable religious also exception of a god or a god king known as Akhenaten. He abandoned traditional worship to promote the cult of Aten, henotheism, or monolatry. But this died with him. And there's an image down here of Akhenaten here worshiping the sun. And what's also very interesting was Akhenaten introduced a kind of very different way of depicting people in photos, and in hieroglyphics and in carvings. And if you look here on the bottom, the people look a little bit different, more alien-like. I guess you would consider them, as compared to what we see in the background image here of the typical Egyptian artwork. Now, from some of the religious changes, science was also very important, and scientific and artisanal advances were very striking. The use of papyrus, for example, to facilitate writing and record keeping was one of the few uses of paper or some type of writing on paper other than stone during this time period. Hieroglyphics, as we can see both in the background and in the top section of the Rosetta Stone here, which are pictographic, gave way gradually to demotic, which is on the bottom section, middle section here, which was more efficient than cuneiform. And the desire to preserve bodies intact or mummification, as we can see in both of these images here, for the afterlife led to advances in medical science, including surgery and knowledge of anatomy. Now, Greeks and Romans were impressed and even dazzled by the Egyptians, as have been most visitors to Egypt since antiquity. And seeing just how influential Egypt actually was, however, is not so easy. Political control lasted a very short time. Divinized kingship recurred, but not necessarily because of the Egyptians. For example, we see this also in Incan civilization and in other parts of the world as well. Obviously, communication between ancient Egypt and those far-flung places in the world probably wasn't as remarkable as it is today. There was no literary forms that were added on to the Egyptian. We have the Book of the Dead, but then not a lot of poetry and literature written afterwards added onto this. And monumental architecture as propaganda recurred, but that doesn't mean it was influenced by Egypt. Right? We see this all over the world in places not even connected to ancient Egypt. Now, of course, early Egyptologists were eager to claim the ancient Egyptians for the West. After World War II, as colonial empires crumbled and black consciousness started to arise, especially in Africa, some people claimed that Egypt was not African civilization, and indeed that Egypt was Africa, and vice versa. In its most extreme forms, this view is held that Western civilization was stolen from the Egyptians by the Greeks. But this view again puts a very sharp focus on Egypt, but without solid reasons for doing so. And if you're more interested in this, Fernand Braudel wrote an excellent work known as Black Athena, with kind of looks at this idea of what is Egypt, right? Is Egypt African, or is Egypt part of the East and part of or the Middle East, and is closer related to ancient Greece? And this idea of what civilizations belong to whom is very important when we study Western civilization, because it kind of just shows the importance and the influence of politics and economics and nation building that developed later on in a Western civilization culture after the Renaissance. I hope you really enjoyed today's discussion of ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. As we learn more about it this week and next week, we'll try to make some connections, and in your reading, kind of look at the importance of climate and the importance of geography. I touched on it a bit here, but your readings and some of your outside research will focus on that. So have a wonderful week, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed today's lecture.